Here's the thing, the Australians are not in a popularity contest, they're in a winning business and they've just won a test as a result of it. This is One-to-One with Simon Jordan, a busy week of sport ahead with Wimbledon launching, and a busy weekend with those Aussies doing what they did to win that test. But let's get on with this week's show. The fact that the run out was within the laws is one thing. The principle of sport is it has certain values attached to it. I'm a great believer in winning, and so the Australians ultimately did what they needed to do to win, and let's not be in any doubt that that changed the direction of travel in that game, because England had got themselves right back into a situation where the nature of the opportunity was swinging back to them, and Bairstow staying in with Ben Stokes I think would have won us the game. I do think it's a combination of lazy batting and not concentrating, and also poor sportsmanship. I'm looking at the principles of how the Australians would have reacted if the reverse had been done to them, and I'm not entirely sure they'd have been too happy. Of course, they're in the business of winning, and there's a ruthlessness about the manner in which they would use whatever they can to be able to win. We've seen it previously. We've seen their previous captain, Steve Smith, get suspended from cricket for ball tampering. So we know that it's their propensity to do whatever it takes to win. This isn't outside the rules. It's probably outside the notion of good form, not the British notion of good form that this simply isn't cricket, but there's a way to win. And Bairstow wasn't seeking any advantage. This wasn't like someone backing up and the bowler coming through and giving him a warning. I've told you on a number of occasions not to do that. This was just poor form from the Australians. And if that's how they want to win, what I'd like to see is a reaction from the English cricketers. I hope this engenders, there was a lot of spirit between Broad and Stokes. Broad put up with a lot of short pitch stuff, and there was a much more relaxed attitude after the game from the England cricketers than I would wager you the Australians would have exhibited. But I've seen subsequently that Ben Stokes has talked about something similar to what I just said, which is that what a way to win a game. Who'd want to win a game that way? We wouldn't. Well, maybe we should. Maybe we should want to win games that way. Maybe we should fight fire with fire, because sometimes if that's the way you operate, then okay, yes, it's within the rules. Yes, there are people like Andrew Strauss and other people are making observations after the game that they would have accepted it. I'm telling you, I bet if that was a game that they were captaining in, their attitude wouldn't be so laissez-faire about it. And also some of the stuff that went on in the long room with the MCC members. Whilst I think some of those guys, the MCC members, probably should have kept their trap shut, this is a team, an Australian team. Have you seen some of the sledging that they give out? And for these guys, whether it be Warner or whoever else it was, to be complaining about the fact that a few people said a few choice words to them about their attitude towards it, I find a bit lily-livered and a bit unnecessary, but that's the society that we live in. And of course there's standards. If you want to have standards of spirit of play on the pitch, I guess you've got to carry that into the members area. But no, I don't come out of that with any admiration. But here's the thing, the Australians are not in a popularity contest. They're in a winning business, and they've just won a test as a result of it. Kyrgios is one of those tennis players that you watch with a degree of admiration because they're a brilliant tennis player. And then in equal measure, it can morph into irritation because he's a bully. I think he's unpleasant on court. Now that comes from somebody that's a huge admirer of John McEnroe and holds John McEnroe up as his favourite player. But there's been a litany of tennis players that are box office for the reasons that are slightly different than what I go to watch tennis for. And that doesn't mean I don't want character, I don't want controversy, I don't want intrigue, and I don't want people that have got a bit of personality. What I do want is to watch stone cold, nailed on winners. And Kyrgios isn't. He's got a lot to say for himself, he's got a lot to say about other people, and has had many observations, and some of them right. And I do think that he is a performer, but he's a noise machine, because when it comes to actually winning big tournaments, he doesn't do it. And there's the conundrum for Kyrgios, because he's bloody good enough. He's a remarkable talent. His biggest battle, I think, is with what goes on between his ears. But as far as headlines for the journalists, and as far as opportunities for column inches to be produced on the back of his antics on courts, then yeah, it'll be a miss. I mean, I didn't like some of the things he said last year about Tsitsipas, but then again, you know, that's for those guys to stake their claim and position themselves and to put their shoulders back and chests out. Do I think he would have won this year? No. Do I think he would have had theatre? No doubt. Do I think some of it would have been a little bit unpalatable? Possibly. But then again, 2 questions in a row about Australians. What do you take from that? The characterisation of a question about who got the better deal, well, that's in the eyes of the people doing the deals. For whatever reason, and I listened to some ridiculous stuff over the last week about fans imploding about the damage that Bowley's doing to their football club, and given that Mason Mount's been sold as an academy player to Man United, they'll never go and watch Chelsea again. Have you bumped your head? Are you outside of your minds? This time last year, or 2 or 3 months earlier, you potentially didn't have a football club. You had an owner that probably disrupted the ecosystem of football to the detriment of most other football clubs by buying Chelsea 20 years ago and building it into a club, a manufactured club, albeit a great club with great achievements, but a club that was built on Abramovich's money and changed the landscape. And then you get that guy sanctioned. So the government have to intercept or intercede, and you get an American guy that comes in that makes a few mistakes, and all of a sudden people are talking about Bowley's ruining your football club. For the love of God. The Mason Mount issue, if I listen to people like Danny Murphy, which of course I will do because they are really good analysts and have played the game at the highest level, he tells me that he believes that Mason Mount is an absolutely wonderful footballer. But then again, Murphy also told me that when James Maddison gets back in the Leicester side, they'll stop losing games. Here they are in the Championship. Maddison was in the side. So whilst I take him at face value, I do think once he alights upon a particular player, they can do no wrong. Mason Mount's a good player. He's a good player. Chelsea have produced a good player from their academy, and there are plenty of sides that have gone in the past that have built young players and sold them. And everything has a shelf life. And clearly, if Pochettino, in my view, if Pochettino had wanted Mason Mount and it was such an important part of Pochettino's plans, I'm pretty damn sure coming into Chelsea, given the fact that the owner chased him uphill and down dale to get him to do the job, that if Pochettino had wanted to keep Mason Mount, they'd have found some way. Now, I think that 55, 60 million quid is a lot of money, and I think it's probably slightly over-egging it for Mason Mount. So it means Chelsea have done okay. They've bridged the gap of some of the decisions they've made financially and enabled the players that they've bought in that no one's seen the best of yet to have space. Some would say space in the dressing room because they're so bleeding overcrowded. But I think they've achieved decent money. United have bought a player to, will it get them where they want to go? No. Will it make them slightly better? It will give them, I think, sideways opportunities. I don't mean the way that the ball is passed, but I mean more opportunity to have a balanced squad, to go into Europe and to compete and to perhaps push on. But I don't think he makes them a title-challenging player. It's not a title-challenging decision. And the loyalty side of things doesn't come into it. Chelsea's obligation to Mason Mount was to look after him, develop him, give him an opportunity to be a top-class footballer and pay him. And that's what they've done. And Mason Mount's obligation to Chelsea was to give the best he could under the contracts that he was given. And I think most people would suggest that that's been a relationship that's had a degree of equitability in it. So I don't think loyalty comes into it. Mount goes off to Man United. What is interesting is the age-old ideal that the top clubs don't sell to one another. Well, they do when it suits them, because you've now got a situation where clubs are regularly selling their players to one another, to competitors. What that says about the player, I don't know. But what it does do is it tells you that business is being done between the bigger clubs. So I think it's a move that will promote interest. It might give United a bit more substance in the middle of the park and a bit more legs in certain spaces. But again, I don't think it makes them win things any more than they won last year. So with that in mind, I think it's a transaction that has a degree of neutrality for me about the value of it, but it's worked for both sides, I suspect. Well, if I were a boxing promoter, I'd probably have a very different outlook than the one I have now, because what I would do is probably talk in riddles, never do what I say I'm going to do, tell a pack of lies, and then misrepresent everything. But that's if I were a boxing promoter replicating certain boxing promoters that are out there. If I were a boxing promoter that was looking at solutions at enhancing the opportunity, well look, the complaints that are being made about boxing promotion at this moment in time are predominantly around the heavyweight division. Other fights are being made. We're seeing great fights being made. We're seeing Errol Spence versus Terence Crawford coming up at the end of this month. We've seen, Tank Davis fight Ryan Garcia, and we're seeing Callum Smith fighting Beterbiev. So these are good fights out there. We've seen cruiserweight fights for world championships between Lawrence Okoli and Chris Billam-Smith, which by no means am I saying was a great fight. We saw Eubank Jr. versus Liam Smith. So across the pantheon of divisions, we've seen no problems in making fights. And of course, we've obviously seen Lee Wood and Mauricio Lara, and we've seen Josh Taylor lose to Teofimo Lopez. So there's been good fights. The problem is the heavyweight division. And the problem is in the heavyweight division is people aren't being honest. It's okay blaming the promoters, and I do hold them to account when they start trotting out a load of old nonsense about the reasons why. There's one reason, and one reason only, why the big fights that people crave for aren't being made. It's because of Saudi money. And until the Saudi money lands and contracts are offered, to some extent the promoters are stymied, because you've got a situation where they know that the fighters want to fight in Saudi, and they know that the money that the Saudis are putting on the table to the big fighters, whether that be Fury and Joshua, who are the financial express trains, and ultimately Usyk and Wilder, that are, albeit Usyk's a champion, I think economically in the value of the broadcasters, he's behind, Fury and Joshua, and probably to some extent behind Wilder, albeit his achievements certainly aren't. And I think that's the difficulty that the promoters have. What I think the public would like to see is the nonsense being stopped about who's going to fight when, how and what, and ultimately fighters just saying, here's the thing, I've told my promoters that I only want to fight in Saudi because it's the only place that pays me, because after the top fighters don't fight in Saudi, they think they're getting paid less money than they should be getting. Now, that being said, if we see Dillian Whyte fighting Anthony Joshua, good, that fight's getting made. Joe Joyce fighting Zhilei Zhang as a rematch, that's a good fight. Daniel Dubois fighting Usyk, that's a good fight. The situation around Joe Joyce is slightly different than some of the other fighters because Joe has a need. He has a need to establish himself, so he'll take that rematch with Zhang because it gets him back into a WBO mandatory position. So I think there are too many belts. I think there are rematch clauses being put into fights that shouldn't be allowed to be put into them. I don't think any fight outside of a world title fight should have a rematch clause attached to it. And I think mandatories, I think you shouldn't be listening to nonsense from the WBC that suggests that Tyson Fury doesn't have to fight because he's a special kind of champion. So I think that the WBC and all the belts should have a mandatory position that ultimately people are made to fight at least twice a year with all medical considerations being put into play. And that if they don't, belts are stripped away. And I think that if we had less belts, then maybe we'd have a situation where once upon a time it was a WBA and a WBC. Then we saw the IBF and then we saw the WBO. Now we're seeing the IBO on top. And whilst it creates more opportunities for more fighters to get a world title, it also creates confusion and conflation of what people think their achievements are. But I think it's unfair for me to just sit here and say, well, if I were this and I were that. In the heavyweight division, there is a unique conundrum, but given that the question has been answered by suggesting we've got a series of fights that are now on the slate, what people are saying is, why aren't we getting Fury Joshua? Why aren't we getting Usyk versus Fury? Why aren't we getting Wilder versus XYZ? And the reason is because unless the Saudis want, or Middle Eastern money wants to do fights on a more sophisticated and streamlined basis to fulfill the needs of the boxing fan, you're only going to see them when they want to put them on. And the fighters are only going to want to go there when the Saudis suggest that they're ready to put a fight on. So this four-header that was rumoured for December is in part the reasons why some of these fighters haven't gotten in the ring. There's also an element of some of them a little bit difficult to deal with. I think the promoters have got to get a little bit more control of their fighters, but it's easier said than done. Try controlling Tyson Fury, he's a law unto himself. So it's easy for me to spray gun and sort of splatter criticism on the promoters. I do get some of it, but I also think that they should be a little bit mature on how they work together, rather than sit there telling one another what they think of one another in certain ways. Business is done because of people rather than in spite of people. So there's my dime store tour as to what should be happening in boxing. But I think as we come up to, if we get White in against Joshua, we're going to see if Joshua's got anything left, because I think White wants to bloody tear his head off. I think it's fascinating we've got Dubois versus Usyk, because Frank Warren is adamant Dubois is going to win that fight. I can't see it, but we'll see. And of course, we're going to see Joe Joyce and Zhilei Zhang, and those are all good fights to be commended. But we want more of it. Right, that's it for this week's edition of One to One with Simon Jordan. Don't forget to let me know your views on who got the better deal, Mason Mount, Man United or Chelsea. The Australians, really? Do we like that sort of behaviour? Is it all about winning? Of course it is. And finally, the boxing world. Are we all getting a bit fed up with not seeing the big heavyweight fights? Don't forget to like and subscribe. Keep leaving your questions in the comment section below. And I'll see you next time out.